So I don't need to introduce myself any further because Tanya has done a far better job than I could do of that. But just to say, it's really, really wonderful to be here. So I'm going to start off with a question because yes, I am all about sharing. And so my question to you, and if you are on Zoom, you'll be able to post in the chat. My question to people that are here is what's the real message of Purim? What is Purim really about? Any thoughts? Answers not on a postcard. Those were not home-baked ham and tashen, by the way. I'm gluten-free, so I probably couldn't eat them. But any ideas what is the real message of Purim? Any thoughts? Any ideas?
Don't put the pressure on me.
Michael, I'm looking at you.
No.
Well, Purim is really all about unity. And what we know is we think about, Haman. We think about the symbol of Haman, and what did he stand for? He stands for division and persecution, and the opposite of unity. Haman came into being at a time when Jews were disconnected, when we weren't unified. And he seized the opportunity to create and wreak havoc upon the Jewish community of the time. But then, of course, we had Mordecai. And Mordecai was all about building bridges. And that's absolutely what we need to be doing. We need to be sharing, we need to be unifying, particularly at a time of such difficulty, where we have a war raging in Ukraine. We need to come together to bring peace to that part of the world. Because this war affects everybody. It affects humanity. And so I'm going to urge you tonight to join with me on a journey of unity, to look at how we can care and share for the planet, and how we can bring peace by the actions that we take, by the things that we choose to do every day. Because inside every single person here, online and in this room, there is a change maker. And at times like this, we might feel very challenged that we don't have the power to make a change and make a difference, but we do. We do have the power to make a difference, and there are many ways in which we can do that. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to the stories of 7 change makers. I'm going to tell you about the 7 traits that make up a change maker. I'm going to share 7 truths, and I'm also going to share 7 actions that we can take for people and planet. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my book and my journey. So back in 2016, I joined with a great friend, photographer, Sophie Scheinwald, fellow Brightonian, well actually she's in Hove, and together we embarked on a journey to bring these stories of change makers the world over who are creating positive action for people and planet. And we travelled the globe, we raised funds through Kickstarter to be able to travel to tell positive stories of change makers. Because I believe that to change the world, first of all, we need to change the narrative. We need to start telling positive stories of hope. And particularly at times we're in right now, it's these positive stories of hope that we need to transform our world. So the first change maker that I'm going to introduce you to is Artie Naik. And the first trait that I'm going to introduce you to is, of course, it's been mentioned already by Tanya, is this idea of sharing. Now, Artie Naik, she lives in the slums in India, one of the largest slums in Mumbai, in the slum of Mulund. And she decided, she looked around her at a very young age, and she saw there was no future for girls. They were going to be married at a young age, they could be sold into prostitution, they did not have a life and a future for themselves. And she wanted to change that. But she didn't just want to do it for herself, she wanted to do it for others. She wanted to share that journey with others and wanted to make a transformation in her community. And what she did was she set up Saki School for Girls Education, a school that to this day operates out of the slums in Mumbai. And she heard about this campaign that I ran on Kickstarter, and she contacted me on LinkedIn. And she said, Benita, will you come to India and tell my story? I am a change maker. I am Generation Share. And I just thought, goodness me, if a girl 5,000 miles away from where I live in Brighton has written to me, has reached out and asked me to come and visit her, then there's no end to potentially what this kind of sharing of positivity could do. And so indeed, Sophie and I raised funds and off we went to meet her in her slum in England. to bring these extraordinary stories of the girls whose lives she's completely transformed. So I'd like to start here with a truth about sharing. So every 3 seconds, someone dies from hunger. Yet, 1.3 billion tons of food, that's a third of our food, is wasted globally every single year. So the reality is, we have enough food, perfectly good food, to feed over 10 billion people. And that proves and evidences that food sharing could end world hunger and save over 36 million lives per year, people that die from starvation, over 36 million in 2022. So we have everything that we need. We have enough resources, but what we need to be doing is sharing those resources. So what action can you take? How can you share? Well, one of the things that you can do is a very simple exercise. When you get up on a morning, ask yourself, what can I share today? Now, that could be something as simple as sharing a smile with a neighbour. It could be offering help, sharing your time. It could be supporting a food bank. It could be donating to a charity. There are lots of food sharing charities. Fair Share is an extraordinary organisation. Last year, they delivered over 53 million meals to people living in food poverty out of food that would have needlessly gone to landfill, saving lives every step of the way. There are apps like Olio, where you can share food with other people in your community, leftover food that you may have that you might not need, and prevent waste. All kinds of ways in which you can be sharing. So now I'd like to introduce you to an extraordinary change maker who lives locally to me in Brighton, called Jacob Berksen. And at the age of 21, he suffered a horrific spinal cord injury whilst on kibbutz in Israel. This put him in a wheelchair for life. But Jacob is an incredibly brave man. And the second trait that I want to talk about is the trait of bravery. And what Jacob did was that he decided that his mission in this world was to change the lives of others. And he set up an organisation called 1000 for 1000. And what Jacob does is he crowdfunds rent for refugees, a particularly pertinent challenge at this moment in time, where we're seeing refugee crisis after refugee crisis. And when we start to think about the millions that have already fled from Ukraine, this is a sizable problem the world over. And Jacob believes that every single one of us can help this problem. Now, I received a text from him this morning. I'm just going to read it. Yes. Okay. So Jacob said to me, he said, the one thing that I would say is that making refugees welcome means making homes, and that costs money. It also requires a community working to bring people in. We have to resist the idea that all we have to do is provide temporary shelter and that entry to society is predicted on your usefulness to us. That's the logic of tyrants like Putin. The tyrant is the one who refuses to share a world with others. To oppose the tyrant is to practice radical hospitality, to find a way of making a space for all, because whether we like it or not, we in fact share the same place, the same planet. The only question is, how are we going to make that work? And as I mentioned, Jacob is somebody who feels very passionately about making that work, and this is what he's doing through 1000 for 1000. So I'm going to start with the truth. So just this past week, many of us have been celebrating International Women's Day. And International Women's Day, many of you might not know, was inspired by Clara Lemlich, a Jewish Ukrainian suffragist who demanded better pay and working conditions for 15,000 garment workers and led strike action in New York in 1909. An incredibly brave woman, as she has inspired what we now know to be International Women's Day. So what brave actions can we take for people and planet? Well, the first thing that we can do is to call it out. If we hear or see something that we feel is unjust, that we feel is just not right, then call it out. What injustices do you see in your life or your work? Connect and mobilize others to take action. Start your own campaign, because that's what someone like Jacob did. I started a campaign over a decade ago to promote this idea of sharing resources. How can you join others? Eco Synagogue, for example, is a brilliant campaign. How can we, as Jewish communities, make a better contribution to the planet? There are platforms like change.org and 38 Degrees. You can start your own protest, your own petition. It's up to us to take that action. Now, the next change maker that I'd like to introduce you to is Amos Davidovitz. And this third trait is all about change, behavior change, and how we can adapt. Because change makers know that we must change. To create world change, it starts with us, it starts with ourselves. And what we need to do is find ways to shift behavior, to create behavior change. Now, Amos Davidovitz is based on Kibbutz Gezer in Israel. And this is an environmental kibbutz. They run campaigns for the planet. They've done extraordinary projects across Israel. And Amos works as part of the kibbutz movement leadership, because he is all about adapting this movement. You know, the kibbutzim, this is an original form of sharing. And it's one that, you know, many of us are very proud of. And what Amos is doing is looking at how we can reimagine that movement for this century. And every step of the way, it's looking at how can we create behavior change and behavior shift, and how can we adapt to the here and the now and for the future. So I'm going to talk about a truth, because when you think about behavior change, what aspect of our behavior can we change? Well, many of you might not know that veganism is the fastest growing lifestyle movement in the world. And it's the single biggest way to reduce our carbon footprint by an extraordinary 73%. So if we're looking at ways to help the planet, one of the things that we can do is to eat more plant-based foods. And we can do this gradually. This doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation. How can you change your behavior one step at a time? Eat more plant-based foods. Some people like in January to sign up for Veganuary. You can try it for a month. But the point is that we need to take those initial steps to create that behavior shift. So think about, how can you adapt? How can you make a more positive contribution, one small step at a time? The fourth trait is love. And I want to introduce you to an extraordinary woman. Here she is, Natalie Schenker. She's wearing medical garb. And she set up something called Heart's Milk Bank. It's the UK's first breast milk bank. And what she's doing through her breast milk bank is saving the lives of sick and premature babies. And it's now estimated the world over that over 2 million babies' lives have been saved through the sharing of human milk. Absolutely extraordinary. And you think about that chain, you think about those volunteers who've come forward, those women with babies who've come forward to share their milk, and how what they're doing is they're also instilling in their own children. One of the women that I interviewed for Generation Share, who was sharing her milk, and she talked about how her toddler would see her doing this, and she was bringing up her child to learn that the milk that she could share from his younger baby brother was actually saving lives, one baby at a time. Extraordinary. So there are so many different forms of sharing. But Natalie's real passion is, how can we bring love into this world? Love and kindness. And that is imbued through everything that she does with Heart's Milk Bank. Really extraordinary trailblazer. Very, very modest, didn't want to have a photograph taken. Now here's the truth. I've mentioned volunteering, which is a brilliant way to show love in your community. So 12.4 million people volunteered during the COVID pandemic. 12.4 million people, that's in the UK alone. And we know that volunteering has been recognised as one of the most powerful social interactions that reduces the risk of physical and mental health issues. It's an extraordinary way, both for those who volunteer and those who are receiving help. So let's talk about action. How can you show love for others? How can you volunteer your time? I know my father's listening to this, and one of the things that he's been doing up in the Leeds Jewish community is buddying. He's been taking time to speak to somebody who is lonely and isolated on the phone. Very simple action, might take 15 minutes of your time. There's something now called micro-volunteering, where we share a piece of our time. And you know, we all have 15 minutes. I mean, who doesn't have 15 minutes? I'm sure we can all spare 15 minutes. So think about how you could share your time. But another way that we can show our love for people and planet is if you're dealing with a really challenging situation, something that is an absolute conundrum. How am I going to deal with this situation? Ask yourself a simple question. If love were a person in this situation, what would love do? And you will be amazed at the response and the answers that come to you from asking that very simple question. Now, the next person that I'd like to introduce you to is Matan Israeli. And this trait is about positivity. And Matan is involved in a project in Jerusalem. It's run nationwide in Israel. And it's the Maslala Collective. And what they're doing is they are creating positive actions for people and planet by bringing people together across all sorts of divides and showing that another way is possible. And here you can see is standing in front of, this was a building, it's the Klal building, which was a disused shopping mall in Jerusalem. And this building had been left derelict for years, just left derelict, empty, an unused resource. And what Matan did was he, along with a group of volunteers, they came in, they cleaned it up, and they've turned it into this extraordinary eco-social enterprise, positive project for the city of Jerusalem. And so, you know, there are food banks, there are food collectives, there are all kinds of social entrepreneurs that are working there, creative workshops that are being run. And what they're saying is actually from what was something that was an unused resource, we're showing that another city is possible. We can take these unused resources and we can transform them. However difficult that journey may be, with positivity. We're positive, there are all kinds of things that we can achieve. Now, this is a truth for you. Today, less than 10% of the world lives in extreme poverty. And that's compared to 36% 3 decades ago. Now, we may not think that, but the reality is that 95% of the stories that are published or broadcast are negative. And what we do know is that exposure to negative events and violence is more likely to result in negative actions towards others. So if what we're receiving on a daily basis is negativity, that's what we're going to put out to others. That's how we're going to portray ourselves in a negative way. We're going to have negative relationships. So the action for all of you is to think about, how can you change the narrative? How can you share positivity? A positive story, perhaps, for those that are on social media. How could you post a positive story? Or talk to someone about something positive that's happened every single day? What can you do to spread that positivity? And how can you showcase positive change? I spend a lot of time bringing these stories to public attention because, quite frankly, there are more change makers out there in the world than people who are creating negative impacts. But we just need to hear more about these change makers. So the next trait is joy. And I'd like you to meet Haytham Deeb. Haytham Deeb is an extraordinary man that I had the fantastic opportunity to meet. So I spoke at an event in Israel called Share Israel at Tel Aviv University, which was all about bringing sharing and positivity. And I went to visit Haytham in the school that he teaches in. He's a farmer, a footballer, and a teacher. What a winning combination. My son was very impressed that I was there with this footballer, this very cool footballer. He plays for the Palestinian team, and he's part of an initiative. It's a peace school in East Jerusalem. And this peace school is all about teaching positivity and bringing joy to the kids that go to this school. And it's a Palestinian-Israeli cooperative project. It's really extraordinary. But what they're doing is giving these kids the joy of planting. So here, he was teaching this class of how to plant. They were having a whole lesson, and he's very passionate being a farmer about agriculture. And his point is that, if we teach children that taking care of the planet and the land is joyful, and if we are joyous towards each other, and we're doing this together, then you're not going to get these acts of violence and negativity and xenophobia to one another. This is going to cut down and eliminate prejudice. And we're going to start to think about each other in a more positive, peaceful way. So he's all about bringing that joy. Now, joy is an interesting thing because the truth I have to share with you tonight is that research shows that happiness can make our hearts healthier, our immune system stronger, our stress levels lower, and our lives longer. So there is a direct correlation between happiness and health. So how can you take action to spread more joy? Now, I've just started using something called the Action for Happiness app. And I've downloaded it, it's free to download. And every single day, at the moment, it's Mindful March. And every single day, you're sent an action that you can do to spread happiness. I mean, what's not to love, seriously? But just have a think about that. How can each of us, something very simple, what can we do to spread more happiness in our communities, within our families, for example? Now, finally, the final trait is this idea of looking to the future, thinking about the future. Because this climate crisis, for example, and this current war would not be happening if we had been thinking about and considering the long-term impact of our actions. So I'd like you to meet an extraordinary woman changemaker, Tamar Ben Shalom. And Tamar is now based in Kibbutz Reshit in Jerusalem. Now, she had grown up in a rural kibbutz, and she had this dream of bringing the values and the ideals of kibbutz into the city, into an urban environment. She wants to green the urban environment. But she's not one to take the easy path. None of these change makers are. And so she went to visit this area where this building was in Jerusalem, one of the most impoverished parts of Jerusalem. And at this time, there was rubbish everywhere. The streets were overflowing with rubbish. The place was really polluted and unkempt. Nobody cared for the land. There was gangs and violence and drugs and needles everywhere. It was a real horror of a place. And she came to look at this building that she wanted to transform into a thriving urban kibbutz and school for the next generation. And as she was looking at this building, this woman came out and she said, what are you doing here? Like, go away, go back to where you came from. Like, have you not noticed there's no love in this place? Have you not noticed that you won't hear a single bird sing in this neighborhood? And she vowed that what she was going to do was to bring the birds back, because she knew that if she could tend to the land, she could find ways of making this beautiful and green. People would care for one another, they would care for the land, and they would bring the birds back. And so she set off on this mission. She was not a wealthy woman. She was not somebody who had access to influence or power. She battled with authorities to get this school. And Sophie and I went to visit her at Kibbutz Reshit, and it is an extraordinary place. An extraordinary place. She has transformed the neighborhood, and she has brought the birds back. Because she was thinking about the long-term future. What can we grow here? If we focus on the next generation and teaching the next generation these values of peace and unity and positivity and thinking about the long term and sharing and love for the planet and people in it, valuing each other, there is no end to what we teach. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most emotional interviews of all of the interviews. I interviewed over 200 changemakers all over the world. And this one, she had us sobbing every step of the way. And it was just completely extraordinary. And she brought the birds back to that impoverished. So I'd like to share some truths with you. The latest research shows that many climate change impacts are now irreversible, with 40% of the world highly vulnerable. But there are enough climate solutions that could undo 30 years of carbon damage by avoiding 1,500 billion tons of CO2, keeping the rising temperatures below that critical 1.5 degrees. The fact is, if we start to consider the future impacts of everything we do, just like Tamar did, we can make a difference. So make a commitment on Purim. Make a commitment tonight to reduce your carbon footprint. Consume less. And when you do, buy pre-loved. I'm a big fan of vintage, and everything that I'm wearing tonight is actually Brighton vintage. This is all a Brighton vintage outfit. But the point is that we can share resources. That's one way we can extend the life of products. We don't have to buy everything new. And actually, when you go out to buy something, ask yourself a question. Do I need to buy that? Certainly, do I need to have it delivered tomorrow? And certainly, does it need to be covered in plastic? Save and plant trees. Now, this is one extraordinary way in which we can lower our carbon footprint. There's a fantastic platform, website called Ecology with an I at the end. And for less than a cup of coffee per week, you can become climate positive. Absolutely extraordinary. All kinds of ways through this platform. I've started recently a friend's birthday presents. I gift them 100 trees. It cost me £12.50. That's what it costs to plant 100 trees, and they can find out in their name, and they can find out where the trees are planted, what the social impact of those trees, because it's not just the planetary benefits, but there are social impacts. People that are being paid to plant the trees, the livelihoods that are being protected, the forests that are being protected, upon which those communities, for example, in the Amazon, absolutely depend their livelihoods and the benefits of their children. There are all kinds of ways in which we can take these positive actions, considering the future impact of everything we do. So I'd just like to ask you to take a minute. I'm probably running over my time, but I'd like to ask you just to take a minute and just to think about these change makers and these traits and these truths and what action you are going to take for Purim. And whatever you do, I'm asking you to make a commitment tonight to take an action for people and planet. You don't even have to leave your home to do that. Everybody can contribute something, because inside each of us is a change maker, the change maker that we were born to be. So whether you're sharing like us, whether you're brave like Jacob, whether you're adapting like Amos, whether you're showing love like Natalie, whether you're being positive like Natan, whatever you're doing, whether you're bringing joy like Hazel, whether you're considering the future like Tamar did, there is something that every single person that's listening to this can do to make this world a better place. So I'd like to ask you, for Purim, to commit to being the change maker that you were born to be. And I'd like you, in your homes, wherever you are watching it, I'd like you to stand up if you are in, and if you are committed to doing this. I'd like you to stand up if you want to act for people and planet. Everybody's involved, whether you're on Zoom, whether you're on YouTube, or on Facebook, it doesn't really matter where you are. But obviously, if you're able to stand up, I absolutely appreciate there are those that cannot stand. But if you are able, and if you're not able to stand, I'm going to ask you to put a hand up. And if you're not able to do that, I'm going to ask you to nod, whatever it is that you're able to do, but to show that you are making a commitment. Because every single person can help, caring and sharing and being positive and show love for people and planet and to take action. Well, that's one way to get a standing ovation. Thanks for listening.